The sound of chainsaw engines drowned out my protests as three men in yellow vests approached my property line. Behind them stood Sheriff Sheila, arms crossed, wearing that same smirk that had haunted me for months. The trees, my father's legacy, some older than I was, were about to be reduced to stumps because of fabricated code violations. I planted my feet at the edge of my land, staring into her cold eyes. "This is private property," I shouted over the mechanical roar. "Those trees are not coming down today." Sheriff Sheila stepped forward, her badge catching the morning light. "Actually, they are, and if you interfere with county business, you will be spending the night in my jail." She unclipped the handcuffs from her belt, jingling them like car keys. "Your choice." My hands trembled as I stood between the workers and the old oak my father had planted the day I was born. That is when I noticed something in her hand, a folder with permit stamps that looked oddly familiar. The same stamps I had been researching for weeks. And that is when I knew exactly how to bring her down. There is something sacred about the whisper of wind through leaves, the way sunlight filters through branches, creating dancing patterns on the ground below. This was my inheritance, not just the land or the modest home my father built with his own hands, but this chorus of nature that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. My name is Thomas Larson. I live at the edge of Oak Ridge County, where the town peters out and wilderness begins to reclaim its territory. My house sits on 3 acres, bordered by a county road to the east and thick woods on the remaining sides. My father planted most of these trees, towering oaks, sturdy pines, and flowering dogwoods, each with its own story, growing tall and strong over decades of patient care. When Dad passed 3 years ago, neighbors expected I would sell, move somewhere more convenient, maybe closer to modern amenities, but they did not understand what this place meant to me. Every morning, I wake to birdsong instead of traffic. Every evening, I watch the sunset paint the western tree line in hues that no artist could properly capture. There is peace here that cannot be purchased elsewhere. My workshop stands beneath the shade of the largest oak. It was once my father's garage, but I converted it after inheriting his tools and love for woodworking. Inside those walls, I spend hours crafting furniture, restoring antiques, and breathing in the scent of freshly cut timber. The neighbors know me as the quiet man who can fix anything made of wood. I am not unfriendly, just private. I prefer the company of trees to most people. For 15 years, life continued this way, peaceful, productive, until Sheriff Sheila Matthews was elected to office. I first encountered her at a town meeting last spring. The county had proposed widening Elm Road, my road, to improve what they called emergency response times. But I knew what it really meant. They wanted to cut down the line of trees that separated my property from the asphalt, trees that had stood guard for generations. The meeting room was packed with the usual faces: business owners hopping for more traffic, council members nodding along to whatever was proposed. Sheriff Sheila stood at the podium, pointing to a map of the proposed expansion. "This improvement will decrease response time by approximately 3 minutes," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone unused to being questioned. "It is a matter of public safety." When the time came for community input, I was the only one who stood. "Those trees are on private property," I stated, my voice steadier than I expected. "They have historical and ecological value to this land. There must be alternatives that do not require their removal." The room fell silent. People shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Sheriff Sheila stared at me, her expression unchanged but something flickering behind her eyes, something cold and calculating. "Mr. Larson," she replied, drawing out my name. "Those trees create a visual obstruction that compromises the safety of all residents. Sometimes individual sacrifices must be made for community good. Not when those sacrifices are on land that does not belong to the county, I responded, holding her gaze. After the meeting, as people filed out, Sheriff Sheila approached me. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a uniform that looked fresh from the dry cleaners. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Those trees mean a lot to you," she said. It was not a question. "They are my family's legacy," I answered, "and they are staying put." She nodded slowly, looking past me toward my property as if already measuring it for changes. "We all have our priorities, Mr. Larson. Mine is this community's welfare. I hope we can find common ground." There was no warmth in her voice, no genuine desire for compromise, just the practiced diplomacy of someone who was used to getting her way, one way or another. "The property line is clear," I said. "There is your ground and there is mine." She straightened her badge, which already gleamed in the fluorescent light. "Lines can be redrawn, Mr. Larson. Ordinances can be changed. I would hate to see you fighting a battle you cannot win." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had stood my ground, voiced my objection, protected what was mine. I thought that would be enough. I thought the matter was closed. I was wrong, terribly wrong. The first citation arrived 3 weeks after the town meeting. A plain white envelope with the county seal, delivered by a deputy who would not meet my eyes when I answered the door. Inside was an official notice for tree encroachment causing visual obstruction to public roadway. It demanded immediate trimming of all foliage within 20 feet of the road edge, essentially half of my front tree line. I read it twice, noting the vague reference to Ordinance 47.3, which I had never heard of. The fine print stated I had 10 days to comply or face daily penalties of $200. It was signed by the county code enforcement officer, but I knew exactly who had initiated it. The second citation arrived 4 days later. This one cited potential wildlife hazards from my oak trees, claiming they attracted rodents that could spread disease. There was no evidence provided, no inspection report attached, just another demand and another threat of fines. By the end of the month, I had received 5 separate citations: noise complaints about my workshop, improper water drainage because of root systems, even one claiming my property constituted a fire hazard due to fallen leaves in springtime when there were barely any on the ground. I spent hours researching county codes, driving to the municipal building to file formal appeals against each citation. The clerk took my paperwork with a sympathetic look that told me everything I needed to know. These appeals would sit untouched somewhere, gathering dust while the fines accumulated. Weeks passed with no response to my appeals. Then one Wednesday morning, as I was sanding a cherry wood table in my workshop, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window, I spotted a white truck with Oak Ridge County Maintenance on the door. A man in a neon vest was walking my property line, measuring tape in hand, marking trees with bright orange spray paint. I set down my tools and stepped outside, anger rising like heat from my collar. "Excuse me," I called. "What are you doing on my property?" The man looked up, surprised to see me approaching. He was middle-aged with a weathered face and calloused hands, a working man following orders. "County sent me," he said, holding up a clipboard. "Tree removal scheduled for next Monday, just marking what needs to come down." My heart froze. Tree removal? There must be some mistake. This is private property, and I have filed appeals against all citations. He scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I just go where they tell me. The work order says these trees are in violation of multiple codes. Sheriff's office authorized it directly. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I need to see that work order. He handed me the clipboard, and there it was. Sheriff Sheila's signature at the bottom, authorizing the removal of 17 trees from my property without a court order, without due process, without my consent. I am sorry, I said, handing back the clipboard. But there will be no tree removal here. Those appeals are still pending, and no one has the right to cut anything on this land without my permission or a court order. The worker nodded, seemed almost relieved. I will report back that the owner refused access. They will probably send someone official next time. After he left, I drove straight to the sheriff's office, the work order photographed on my phone as evidence. The reception area was cool and impersonal, with framed certificates and stern-faced deputies moving purposefully behind the counter. I asked to see Sheriff Sheila, waited 43 minutes before being allowed into her office. She sat behind a massive desk, not bothering to stand when I entered. The American flag stood in one corner, and framed photographs of her shaking hands with state politicians lined the wall behind her, all carefully crafted to project authority. "Mr. Larson," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her, "what brings you to my office today?" I remained standing. "Your county workers were marking my trees for removal this morning, trees that are on private property, trees that I have filed appeals to protect." She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her desk. "Those appeals were reviewed and denied. The notifications should have reached you by now." "They did not," I said, knowing full well they had never been sent. "And even if they were, you cannot remove vegetation from private property without a court order." Sheriff Sheila's smile tightened. "Actually, under County Ordinance 47.3 I can. When public safety is at risk, the Sheriff's Department has authority to remove obstructions. Your trees qualify." "Those trees have stood for decades without causing any safety issues," I argued. "This is about the road widening project, not safety." She stood slowly, placing both hands on her desk and leaning forward. "Mr. Larson, you are obstructing progress. This county is growing, and infrastructure must grow with it. Your sentimental attachment to some plants is becoming problematic." "They are not just plants, they are my property." Her eyes narrowed. "Keep pushing and it will not stop at trees. I can find violations in that workshop of yours, that house. I can make your quiet life very, very complicated. Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air between us, naked, undisguised. I realized then that this was not about safety or progress or community good. This was about power, and Sheriff Sheila was not used to hearing the word no. "Are you threatening me?" I asked quietly. She sat back down, resuming her pen tapping. "I am explaining reality. Be reasonable, Mr. Larson. Things will go much smoother for everyone." I turned and walked out without another word, my mind racing. This was not a battle I could win with direct confrontation. She had the badge, the authority, the county machinery behind her. But her threat had revealed something important. Her confidence bordered on arrogance. And arrogance often leaves tracks. If she wanted to play dirty, I would need to dig deeper, much deeper. The county library became my second home in the weeks that followed. I requested archives of local ordinances, property laws, and building codes, anything that might help me understand what Sheriff Sheila was using against me and how I could defend myself. Margaret, the librarian, raised an eyebrow at my growing stack of legal texts, but asked no questions. Between shifts at my workshop, I pored over documents, making meticulous notes. Something about Ordinance 47.3 bothered me. I finally found it buried in a code book from 15 years earlier. It had been amended and replaced by Ordinance 52.1 over a decade ago. Sheriff Sheila was citing obsolete rules that no longer held legal weight. I was not the only victim of her tactics. Internet searches revealed dozens of complaints about aggressive code enforcement under her administration. Small businesses cited for trivial violations. Homeowners pressured to sell strategic parcels. All dismissed as standard procedure when questioned. One evening, as I was leaving the library with a stack of photocopies, a man approached me in the parking lot. He was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and the careful movements of someone with back problems. I recognized him vaguely but could not place his face. "You are Thomas Larson," he said, not a question. "The tree guy giving Sheila headaches." I tensed, ready for confrontation, but he held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Name is Frank Dawson. I used to be a building inspector for the county before I retired. Been watching you digging through those archives. Figured you might want to talk." We ended up at Mabel's Diner, in a corner booth away from other patrons. Frank ordered coffee and spoke quietly, glancing occasionally toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. "Sheila has been playing fast and loose with building code since she took office," he explained, stirring sugar into his cup. "Started with little things, expediting permits for friends, waiving inspections for certain contractors. Then it got bigger." "Bigger how?" I asked. Frank leaned forward. "She built herself a vacation cabin out by Stillwater Creek 2 years ago. Nice place, 3 bedrooms, lakefront view. Thing is, no one in the permit office remembers approving it." I frowned. "How is that possible?" "Retroactive permits," he said. "Filed after construction, using her authority to push them through without questions. Used outdated zoning codes that were more permissive about waterfront construction. I still have friends in the department. They say the paperwork looks wrong. Signatures that don't match up. Approval stamps from departments that should have rejected the plans." My pulse quickened. If she falsified building permits. "That is a felony," Frank finished. "Abuse of power, fraud, multiple counts." I sat back, mind racing. Why has no one reported this? Frank's laugh held no humor. "Who would they report it to? She is the sheriff. County prosecutor plays golf with her every Sunday. Mayor defers to her on everything. Nobody wants to be the one to throw the first stone." He slid a napkin across the table with an address scribbled on it. "Her cabin. Go see for yourself, but be careful. She has eyes everywhere." The next morning I drove out to Stillwater Creek. The cabin was impressive. Rustic timber frame, wraparound porch, picture windows overlooking the water. Much grander than a sheriff's salary should afford. I took photos from the public road, careful not to trespass. Back home, I began filing public records requests, property deeds, permit applications, inspection reports. I requested watershed impact studies that would have been mandatory for lakefront construction. I asked for copies of all permits issued for that address over the past 5 years. The responses trickled in slowly. Some offices were helpful, others evasive. But piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The cabin had been built in violation of current environmental codes. The permits had been issued using codes from 2007, though construction began in 2022. Most damning of all, several documents bore stamps from departments that had been reorganized years before. They were forgeries, plain and simple. I created a timeline, gathered evidence, built a case as carefully as I would craft a piece of furniture, measuring twice, checking joints, ensuring everything fit together perfectly. This was not just about my trees anymore. This was about justice, about holding power accountable. Late one night, as I organized my findings, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. "Mr. Larson," a woman's voice, hushed and nervous. "This is Rebecca from the county planning office. I heard you have been asking questions." My heart raced. "I have. Those permits you requested copies of. The originals went missing last year. What we have are scans, but I compared the signatures. They do not match our files." "Are you saying they were forged?" I asked directly. A pause. "I cannot say that officially, but if someone were building a case, they might want to look at the approval dates. They all fall on weekends or holidays when our office was closed. No one was here to stamp anything." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Another pause. "Because some of us remember what this office stood for before she took over. Some of us still believe in doing things right." The line went dead. I sat in my darkened kitchen, looking out at the trees silhouetted against the night sky. The stakes had changed. This was no longer just my fight to save my property. This was about exposing corruption that affected the entire county. I made copies of everything, digital and physical, stored backups in multiple locations. If Sheriff Sheila wanted to silence me now, she would find it much harder than simply cutting down a few trees. The truth had taken root, and it would not be so easily removed. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 days after my conversation with Rebecca, a county vehicle pulled into my driveway. 2 deputies stepped out, young men with uncomfortable expressions who clearly wished they were elsewhere. They approached my front door with clipboard in hand. I met them on the porch, phone in my pocket already recording. "Mr. Larson," the taller one began, "we are here to conduct an inspection of your structures for code compliance. Sheriff Sheila has authorized a full property assessment." "Do you have a warrant?" I asked calmly. They exchanged glances. "This is a routine compliance check. We do not need." "Actually, you do," I interrupted. "Without a warrant or my consent, you cannot conduct searches or inspections on private property. Fourth Amendment. So I will ask again, do you have a warrant?" The shorter deputy shifted his weight. "Sir, we are just following orders. Sheriff Sheila specifically requested this inspection today." I pulled out my phone, started recording openly now. "I understand you are doing your job, but I am exercising my constitutional rights. No warrant, no inspection." The taller one stepped forward. "Mr. Larson, refusing could lead to additional citations for obstruction." "Citations that would be dismissed in any court," I replied, continuing to record. "Please tell Sheriff Sheila that if she wants to inspect my property, she needs to follow proper legal procedures." They retreated to their vehicle, speaking into their radios. I caught Sheila's name and what sounded like irritation in their responses. Eventually, they drove away with nothing but footage of themselves attempting an illegal search. That evening, I uploaded the video to social media, tagging local community groups. "County attempting warrantless searches of private property. Know your rights." I included relevant legal statutes and a brief explanation of what had happened. By morning, the video had hundreds of shares. Comments flooded in, other residents sharing similar experiences with aggressive enforcement. A local news blog picked up the story, questioning the sheriff's department's tactics. The tide was turning, slowly but perceptibly. My phone rang constantly the next day. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by to share their stories. Sylvia Jensen, who owned the flower shop downtown, told me about being threatened with parking violations until she allowed campaign signs on her property. Marcus Wheeler, a high school teacher, described fighting citations for his vegetable garden that Sheila deemed unsightly. Each story followed the same pattern: arbitrary enforcement, intimidation, pressure to comply with Sheila's vision for the county. And in each case, those who resisted faced escalating consequences. The most surprising visitor was Benjamin Harris, a town council member who arrived after dark, parking his car down the road rather than in my driveway. "I cannot stay long," he said, declining my offer to come inside. "We stood among the trees that had started this battle. But I wanted you to know there are people on the council who are concerned about Sheila's methods. We just never had enough evidence to challenge her." "And now," I asked, "your video opened a door. People are talking. The mayor is getting calls. The pressure is building." He handed me a business card. "Council meeting next Tuesday. Public comment section. Bring what you have about the cabin. It is time this came to light." After he left, I sat on my porch, watching the stars emerge above the trees. For so long, I had been fighting alone, standing my ground in isolation. Now, suddenly, allies were emerging from every corner of the community. People who had been silenced were finding their voices again. Sheriff Sheila's response came the next morning, not in person, but through official channels. A notice of intent to condemn portions of my property for road expansion was delivered by certified mail. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. She was accelerating her plans, using eminent domain to seize what she could not take through intimidation. It was a desperate move, one that would take months to work through the courts. She was buying time, hoping to silence the growing opposition before her own misdeeds came fully to light. I called Rebecca at the planning office. "I need everything you have on eminent domain proceedings in this county for the past 5 years. Every property, every justification." "Already pulling those files," she replied. "And Mr. Larson, you are not the only one looking now. The county auditor started asking questions this morning." The battle had evolved from my trees to the entire system. Sheriff Sheila had spent years building her power through fear and selective enforcement. Now that foundation was cracking, and she knew it. Her authority was being questioned, her decisions scrutinized. I organized my evidence, prepared my statement, and pressed my best shirt for the council meeting. This would not be just another complaint to be filed and forgotten. This would be the moment a quiet man who preferred the company of trees would stand and speak truth to power. And I would make sure everyone heard it. The county record's office smelled of paper and dust. Ancient filing cabinets lined the walls, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I had been granted access to the physical archives after my third request, a concession from a clerk who seemed tired of the bureaucratic runaround. "1 hour," she told me, pointing to a small desk in the corner. "You can take notes, but no photocopies without approval." I nodded, already focusing on the task ahead. Sheriff Sheila's cabin address, 34 Lakeside Drive, Stillwater Creek, had become as familiar to me as my own. I started with property records, following the paper trail backward through time. The land had been purchased 3 years ago by S&M Holdings, LLC. A quick online search revealed this company had been formed just 1 month before the purchase, with minimal public information. The registered agent was Michael Brennan, Sheila's brother-in-law, according to Frank's information. Next came the building permits. The application had been filed in June 2022, with construction supposedly beginning in August. But something was wrong. The environmental impact report was dated October, 2 months after construction allegedly began. Even more suspicious, it referenced Environmental Code 18.7, which had been replaced by stricter regulations in 2020. I documented everything meticulously, creating a chronology of the paperwork. The pattern became clear. Sheila had built first and secured permits afterward, using outdated codes that would have been more lenient about lakefront construction. The entire process was backward, illegal, and hidden behind a shell company to obscure her involvement. The most damning evidence came in the form of signatures. The approval stamp on the main building permit bore the name of Harold Jenkins, former head of the Environmental Resources Department. But Jenkins had retired in 2021, nearly a year before the permit was supposedly issued. His signature had been used when he no longer held authority. As my allotted hour neared its end, I discovered one final piece of the puzzle, a septic system approval that had never been properly filed. The cabin had a modern waste system, but there was no record of inspection or environmental clearance. In a watershed area like Stillwater Creek, this alone was a serious violation. The clerk appeared at my shoulder. "Time's up, Mr. Larson." I gathered my notes, thanking her politely. She glanced at my legal pad, then back at me. "You found what you were looking for?" she asked quietly. "I believe I did." She nodded almost imperceptibly. The microfiche records are stored separately. Sometimes they contain information that does not make it into the physical files. If you wanted to submit another request. She let the suggestion hang in the air. The next day, I returned with a request for microfiche records related to Stillwater Creek development. While waiting, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Parking garage. 10 minutes." I found Rebecca from the planning office packing between cars, keys clutched tightly in her hand. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark-rimmed glasses and an expression of constant worry. "I should not be doing this," she said by way of greeting, "but you need to see these." She handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of permit applications, the originals, not the versions I had seen in the records. "These were supposed to be digitized and archived," she explained, "but someone removed them from the queue. I found them in a storage closet while looking for office supplies." The difference was immediately apparent. The original applications had no approval stamps, no signatures from department heads. They were essentially blank forms that had been retroactively completed and approved. "This is forgery," I said, stating the obvious. Rebecca nodded. "And fraud and abuse of power, look at the dates." The applications were dated May 2023, nearly a year after the cabin had been completed according to satellite imagery I had found online. Sheila had not only built without permits, but had created a false paper trail after the fact. "Will you testify about this?" I asked, "if it comes to that." Rebecca's face paled. "I have kids, Mr. Larson, a mortgage. I cannot lose my job." "I understand," I said, though disappointment washed through me. Without a witness from inside the system, my evidence would be easier to dismiss as circumstantial or manipulated. "But," she continued, straightening her shoulders, "I did create a sworn affidavit." She pointed to the bottom of the envelope. "Notarized this morning. It does not name me but describes the discovery of these documents and attests to their authenticity. If you need it, you can use it." I was stunned by her courage. "Thank you, this could make all the difference." "Just make it count," she said, already turning to leave. "Some of us have been waiting a long time for someone to stand up to her." That night, I compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Property records showing the shell company, permit applications with impossible dates and forged signatures, environmental clearances that violated current regulations, the affidavit attesting to document manipulation. satellite images showing the cabin completed months before permits were allegedly issued. I created 3 identical packages, one for the County Ethics Board, one for the State Attorney General's office, and one for safekeeping with my lawyer. This was no longer just about defending my trees. This was about exposing corruption that had infected the entire county government. The next morning, I hand-delivered the package to the Ethics Board office. The secretary accepted it with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised by its weight. "This is a formal complaint against Sheriff Sheila Matthews," I explained, "for falsifying government documents, permit fraud, and abuse of authority. I would like to request an official investigation." She stamped the receipt copy with the date and time. "The board meets next Thursday. They will review it then." "Thank you," I said, already knowing that copies were simultaneously being delivered to other offices beyond Sheila's reach. The wheels were in motion now, and they would not stop turning until justice had been served. As I walked back to my truck, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Channel 7 News. Interested in your story. Call if you want to talk." The truth was spreading, taking root like seeds in fertile soil. Sheriff Sheila had spent years building her power through intimidation and deception. Now those same qualities would be her undoing, all because she had threatened the wrong trees, on the wrong property, belonging to the wrong quiet man. The newspaper landed on doorsteps across town with a thud that seemed to echo through the entire county. There it was, splashed across the front page in bold black letters. "Sheriff Sheila built illegal home using forged permits. My evidence, her crimes." The truth laid bare for everyone to see. I held the paper in my trembling hands, feeling a mix of vindication and dread. This was the point of no return. The journalist, a young woman named Melissa, had done her homework. She had taken my documents, verified them independently, and added testimonies from other sources I had not even known about. The story was comprehensive, damning, and impossible to ignore. My phone began ringing minutes after sunrise. Neighbors, friends, even strangers who recognized my name from the article. "Have you seen what Sheila is saying on social media?" my neighbor Frank asked when he called. "She is claiming you fabricated everything because of your trees." I logged onto the town's community page and saw her desperate posts. Sheriff Sheila had written a lengthy statement calling my evidence doctored, and a personal vendetta from a man who refuses to comply with safety regulations. What she failed to provide was any counter-evidence. Not a single legitimate permit, not one official signature, just accusations and misdirection. That evening, the monthly town forum was scheduled at the community center. I had not planned to attend, but now I knew I had to be there. The parking lot was overflowing when I arrived. Inside, the room hummed with tension. People stood in clusters, newspapers clutched in hands, voices low but intense. Sheila arrived 20 minutes late, flanked by 2 deputies. She wore her full uniform, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a power move designed to remind everyone of her authority. Mayor Jennings opened the forum with a visibly uncomfortable expression. "Before we address the regular agenda items, Sheriff Sheila has requested time to address recent allegations published in the County Chronicle." Sheila strode to the podium with rehearsed confidence. Her voice boomed through the speakers as she launched into her defense. "These baseless accusations are nothing more than retaliation from a citizen who has repeatedly violated safety codes," she declared, her eyes scanning the room but carefully avoiding my gaze. "My construction projects have always followed proper procedures. What we are seeing is a coordinated attempt to undermine law enforcement in this community." She continued for 10 minutes, weaving half-truths with outright lies. No specifics, No documentation, just the weight of her badge and the power of her position. When she finished, scattered applause broke out from her few remaining supporters. During the Q&A portion, I stood. The room fell silent. I could feel all eyes turn toward me as I walked slowly to the microphone. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice remained steady. "Sheriff Sheila, I have a simple question," I said, looking directly at her. "If I need a permit to trim my own trees on my own property, why do you not need one for your house?" The question hung in the air. Someone in the back of the room let out a low whistle. Sheila's face hardened. "I have all required permissions for my properties." "Then why do your permit numbers match codes that expired 2 years before your construction began?" I asked. I motioned to the projector operator. "May I?" The young man nodded, and I inserted my flash drive. The screen behind me filled with the documents, her permit application side by side with the county records showing the expired codes. "And why do these signatures belong to officials who were not even working on the dates these were supposedly approved?" I continued, advancing to the next slide showing signature comparisons. The room erupted in murmurs. Sheila's face flushed deep red. One by one, people began to turn away from her. Council members exchanged worried glances. This was not just about trees anymore. It was about trust, about fairness, about one set of rules for everyone. "This meeting is not a trial," Sheila snapped, but her voice had lost its authority. "You are right," I replied. "The trial will come next." The Ethics Board notification arrived in my mailbox 3 days after the town forum. Official-looking and heavy with legal terminology, it confirmed that a formal investigation into Sheriff Sheila had been launched. My hands shook slightly as I read through the document. The board requested my presence at a preliminary hearing the following week. This was real. This was happening. The news spread through town like wildfire. Sheriff Sheila was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an investigation into procedural irregularities. The statement was carefully worded, bureaucratically sterile, but everyone knew what it meant. For the first time in 15 years, Sheila was not in control of the sheriff's department. I prepared meticulously for the hearing, organizing my documents chronologically, making copies, rehearsing my statement. The night before, I could barely sleep. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the silhouettes of my trees against the moonlight. My father had always said that patience was the true measure of strength. I hoped he would be proud of how I had handled this. The County Ethics Board convened in a windowless room at the County Administration Building. 5 stern-faced individuals sat behind a long table, with the board chair, a former judge named Harriet Dempsey, in the center. I presented my evidence methodically, answering their questions with clarity and precision. There was no emotion in that room, just facts and consequences. "Mr. Patterson, how did you first become aware of these permit discrepancies?" Mrs. Dempsey asked, peering at me over reading glasses. "When Sheriff Sheila began targeting my property with questionable citations, I researched local codes to defend myself," I explained. "In doing so, I noticed patterns in how certain permits were processed. That led me to look into her own building projects." The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours. I left feeling drained but satisfied. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, slowly but inevitably. What I had not anticipated was how quickly others would come forward. Within days of my testimony, the Ethics Board received calls from current and former county employees. A zoning clerk named Thomas Barnes provided internal emails showing that Sheila had pressured staff to expedite her permits without proper review. A building inspector admitted to approving her cabin without ever visiting the site fearing retaliation if he refused. Most damning was the anonymous tip that led investigators to a second property, a boat garage built on lake property registered to Sheila's sister, but used exclusively by Sheila. The structure had no permits whatsoever, not even forged ones. It simply existed outside the system, as if the rules did not apply. The investigation expanded beyond building permits. Financial records were subpoenaed, department procedures scrutinized, staff interviewed. What began as an inquiry into one woman's vacation cabin transformed into a comprehensive examination of how power had corrupted an entire system. I received a call from a reporter at the state capitol. "This story has legs beyond your county," she told me. "We're looking at similar patterns in other rural jurisdictions. Would you be willing to go on record about what you found?" That evening, my story aired on the evening news across the state. Small-town sheriff caught in building fraud web. Citizen whistleblower exposes years of corruption. My phone did not stop ringing for days. Other news outlets picked up the story. Online forums buzzed with speculation and additional allegations. Through it all, Sheila remained conspicuously silent. Her social media accounts went dark. Her official vehicle sat empty in the county parking lot. Some said she had left town to stay with relatives. Others claimed she was holed up in her illegal cabin, planning her counterattack. The speculation grew wilder each day she remained out of sight. I kept my head down and continued my work, both with wood and with truth. Each morning, I checked on my trees, running my hands over their bark as if to reassure them that they were safe now. Each evening, I reviewed new documents sent by the ethics board, adding context where I could. 4 weeks into the investigation, I received another official letter. The ethics board had expanded its inquiry to include misuse of office, intimidation of county staff, and possible financial improprieties. What had begun as my personal stand against injustice had grown into something much larger than I had ever imagined. I was no longer fighting alone. The system itself was finally awakening to the cancer that had been growing within it. As I sat on my porch that night watching fireflies dance among my trees, I felt something I had not experienced in months: peace. Not because the battle was over, it was far from that, but because the truth, once exposed to light, has a power all its own. Like a seed breaking through concrete, it cannot be contained forever. Sheriff Sheila's collapse did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It came in waves, each one eroding more of the foundation she had built over 15 years of unchecked authority. The first sign was subtle. Her lawyer, James Whitaker, the same man who had represented her through 2 divorce proceedings and countless departmental issues, quietly filed paperwork to withdraw as her counsel. Professional differences regarding case strategy, the document stated blandly. Translation: he knew she was guilty and refused to be dragged down with her. Next came the political abandonment. Councilman Peterson, who had for years praised Sheila as the backbone of our local law enforcement, was suddenly unavailable for comment. Commissioner Wilson, who had attended Sheila's annual barbecue just months earlier, now claimed they were merely professional acquaintances. At the monthly council meeting, the seat typically reserved for the sheriff remained conspicuously empty. Nobody mentioned her absence. The silence spoke volumes. I watched these defections with a certain detachment. There was no joy in seeing allies scramble away from a sinking ship, only the sad confirmation of how shallow power-based relationships truly are. 7 weeks into the investigation, the protest signs appeared. I first noticed them while driving past her cabin on my way to deliver a bookshelf to a client. Simple poster board with black marker: "One rule for us, none for her." By evening, there were a dozen signs staked along the road leading to her property. By the next morning, the number had doubled. No organized protest, no crowds, just silent accusation in the form of handwritten signs appearing like mushrooms after rain. Sheila finally broke her silence with a video posted to the county's community page. Filmed in what appeared to be her living room, with poor lighting and the American flag positioned awkwardly in the background, she read from a prepared statement. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a conservative blue blouse. Her voice, once commanding, now sounded strained. "My fellow citizens," she began, eyes darting between the camera and her notes. "I have served this community faithfully for 15 years. The recent allegations against me are the result of misunderstandings and procedural oversights, not malicious intent." She continued for nearly 10 minutes, offering vague explanations about paperwork errors and administrative confusion. Not once did she address the forged signatures or the expired permit codes. Not once did she explain the cabin that appeared out of nowhere with no legal documentation. Instead, she pivoted to her record as sheriff, her dedication to the community, her years of service. The video ended with what was clearly intended to be an emotional appeal. "I ask for your patience and understanding as we work through this misunderstanding. I have always put this community first, and I always will." The comments section told the story. "Where are the permits, Sheila? Show us the paperwork. Rules apply to everyone." Within hours, the video had been viewed by nearly everyone in the county and changed not a single mind. As the investigation deepened, new rumors emerged. The ethics board was looking into departmental funds, citations that had been issued and then mysteriously disappeared, property seized during drug raids that never made it into evidence. Each new allegation seemed to inspire two more, as if a dam of fear had finally broken, releasing years of suppressed truths. I encountered Deputy Mills at the hardware store one afternoon. He had been with the department for over a decade, always at Sheila's side during public events. Now he looked smaller somehow, uncertain. "You started something big," he said quietly as we stood in the paint aisle. Not accusatory, just matter of fact. "I only wanted to save my trees," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes pulling one thread unravels the whole sweater." He selected a can of primer and walked away without another word. That conversation stayed with me. I had never set out to bring down a corrupt system. I had only wanted to protect what was mine. Yet here we were, watching the collapse of what now appeared to be a years-long regime of intimidation and rule-bending. The final blow to Sheila's public image came from an unexpected source. The local high school's newspaper published interviews with a dozen small business owners detailing how they had been pressured to contribute to the sheriff's community fund in exchange for expedited permit processing. The student journalists had done what their adult counterparts had been too intimidated to attempt for years. Sheila's world, once expansive and firmly under her control, contracted to the size of her illegally built cabin. No more public appearances, no more authority, no more power to instill fear. For the first time, she was experiencing what she had made others feel: vulnerability, exposure, and the cold reality that no one is above accountability forever. The County Ethics Board hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. I arrived an hour early to find the parking lot already filling with cars, and a small crowd gathering outside the county administrative building. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers reaching for the sky. This was no longer just our local story. It had become regional news, a cautionary tale of small-town corruption finally facing its reckoning. Inside, the large meeting room had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Long tables faced a raised platform where the 5 ethics board members would sit. Rows of chairs were arranged for spectators, already nearly full despite the early hour. I recognized faces from across the county: business owners, farmers, teachers, everyday citizens who had lived under Sheila's shadow for years. I took my seat at one of the front tables, a folder of documents resting before me. My hand instinctively reached for the inner pocket of my jacket, where I had placed an old photograph of my father standing proudly among the saplings that would grow into the mature trees I had fought to protect. For strength, I whispered to myself. At precisely 9 o'clock, the side door opened and the ethics board members filed in. Chair Harriet Dempsey led the procession, her face solemn and composed. The room fell silent as she took her seat and adjusted the microphone. "This hearing of the County Ethics Board is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "We are here to present findings in the matter of Sheriff Sheila Morrow and allegations of misconduct in office." The door at the back of the room opened and Sheila entered. She was accompanied by a new attorney, a young man from the city who looked nervous and overwhelmed. Sheila herself wore civilian clothes, a gray pantsuit that seemed to drain the color from her face. Her eyes remained fixed forward as she walked to her table, not acknowledging the whispers that followed her path. For the next 3 hours, the evidence unfolded methodically. The building inspector testified about the pressure to approve permits without inspection. The planning clerk described altered documents and backdated applications. A forensic accountant detailed inconsistencies in the sheriff's department financial records. When my turn came, I spoke clearly and directly, presenting the original documents that had started the investigation. I explained how my research had begun as self-defense and evolved into something much larger. "I never set out to expose corruption," I said, looking directly at the board members. "I only wanted to be treated fairly under the law, but what I discovered was that for some people, the law was not a standard to uphold but an obstacle to circumvent." Throughout the proceedings, Sheila maintained a stone-faced expression. Her attorney occasionally leaned over to whisper in her ear, but she rarely responded. It was as if she had already retreated from the moment, knowing what was coming. After the last witness, Chair Dempsey announced a brief recess. The room buzzed with conversation as people stretched and speculated about the outcome. I stepped outside for fresh air, finding myself face to face with Thomas Barnes, the zoning clerk who had provided crucial testimony. "I should have spoken up years ago," he said quietly, "but I have a family to support. I was afraid." "We all were," I replied. Fear was her real power. When the hearing resumed, Chair Dempsey's expression told the story before she spoke a word. The board had reached its conclusions, and they were decisive. Based on substantial evidence presented to this board, we find Sheriff Sheila Morrow guilty of multiple violations of county ethics policies and state law, she announced. These violations include falsification of government documents, abuse of authority for personal gain, intimidation of county employees, and misappropriation of departmental resources. The room remained silent as she continued. "The penalties for these violations are as follows: immediate termination from the position of county sheriff, a fine of $75,000 to cover investigation costs and damages, a permanent ban from holding any public office or position of authority within this county." Chair Dempsey paused, then added, "Additionally, all findings from this investigation will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges." The gavel struck with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire building. 15 years of unchecked power ended with that sound. Sheila stood slowly, gathered her papers, and turned to face the room. For a moment it seemed she might speak, offer some final declaration or defense. Instead, her eyes swept across the gathered citizens, lingering briefly on me. Something passed between us in that moment, not forgiveness, not understanding, but a simple acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed. Without a word, she walked out the back door, footsteps echoing into silence. The sound of those receding footsteps marked the end of an era for our town. As people filed out of the hearing room, many stopped to shake my hand or offer quiet thanks. I accepted their gratitude with humility, knowing that my initial motivation had been personal, not heroic. It was only in standing firm for my own rights that I had unwittingly created space for others to reclaim theirs. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. The maple trees along the courthouse lawn had begun to turn, their leaves flashing gold in the midday sun. I thought about my own trees at home, still standing, still growing, their roots holding firm against whatever storms might come. Spring arrived with a gentle persistence that reminded me of my father. The dogwoods bloomed first, their white flowers like stars against the deepening green of the forest edge. I spent most of April in my workshop, with the doors wide open to welcome the warming air. The scent of freshly cut cedar mixed with wild honeysuckle as I worked on a commissioned dining table for the new elementary school principal. My property had grown quieter since the hearings. No more surprise inspections. No more citations slipped under my door. The trees that had been the original battleground stood tall and unbothered, their canopies filling out with new growth. They had survived just as I had. We had weathered the storm together. On a clear Saturday morning, I walked to the eastern edge of my property with 3 saplings cradled carefully in my arms. I had selected them months ago from the county nursery: a red oak, a sugar maple, and a river birch. 3 different species, 3 different purposes, but all native to our soil and climate. I dug the first hole near where my father had planted his first tree decades ago. The earth was dark and rich between my fingers as I worked. "This one is for you, Dad," I whispered as I lowered the red oak sapling into the ground, "for teaching me that some things are worth fighting for." The second hole I dug closer to the workshop. The sugar maple would eventually provide shade for warm summer days of work. "This one is for the fight," I said, packing soil around its delicate roots, for standing ground when it would have been easier to give in. The third hole I placed near the road, where passers-by would see it grow over the years. "And this one is for what comes next," I said to the river birch as I watered it thoroughly, "for the community we're rebuilding." That rebuilding had begun almost immediately after Sheila's removal. The interim sheriff, a thoughtful deputy named Rodriguez who had always seemed uncomfortable with Sheila's tactics, implemented new transparency protocols. The county council passed ordinances requiring multiple signatures on permits and creating an independent review process for code violations. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones that shifted power back toward balance. My workshop had become something of an unofficial gathering place. People stopped by not just for furniture repairs or custom pieces, but to talk, to share stories of their own experiences under Sheila's regime, to ask advice about property issues or building codes. I was no expert, but I had learned enough through necessity to point them in the right direction. One afternoon, I received a call from the Regional Land Rights Committee, a group that advised counties on property law and environmental regulations. "We'd like you to join us as a citizen consultant," the chairperson explained. "Your experience offers a valuable perspective on how regulations affect ordinary property owners." I almost declined. I was a carpenter, not a politician or an activist. But then I thought about how things change. not always through grand gestures, but through small stands taken by ordinary people who simply know what is right. I'd be honored, I replied. At my first committee meeting, I sat among lawyers, environmental scientists, and career bureaucrats, feeling distinctly out of place in my work boots and flannel shirt. But when I spoke about the balance between regulation and rights, about the importance of clear rules applied equally to everyone, they listened with genuine interest. Sometimes the law gets used as a weapon instead of a shield, I told them. When that happens, people lose faith not just in individuals but in the whole system. Driving home that evening, I passed by Sheila's infamous cabin. It stood empty now, with a for sale sign swinging in the breeze. She had moved to another state after the criminal charges were filed, accepting a plea deal that kept her out of prison but permanently ended her career in law enforcement. The cabin would eventually sell, and someone new would make it a home, this time with proper permits and honest paperwork. I thought about power as I drove, how it corrupts when concentrated, how it heals when shared. Sheila had built her authority on fear and favoritism. In the end, those foundations proved weaker than the quiet determination of ordinary citizens standing together. Back home, I walked among my trees in the fading light. The oldest ones towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral of rustling leaves. The newest saplings stood barely waist-high, their futures still unfolding. Together, they formed something more than a collection of individual plants. They created a small ecosystem, each supporting the others in ways visible and invisible. I ran my hand along a rough oak trunk, feeling the solid strength beneath my fingers. My father had understood something fundamental when he planted these trees. He knew that the strongest walls are not made of brick or stone or authority. They are made of roots that reach deep into something true, something lasting. When Sheila had tried to rip out those roots, she discovered what many powerful people learn too late. Truth has a patience that outlasts intimidation. Justice may move slowly, but it moves inevitably when enough people stand firm. That evening, as fireflies began to rise from the grass, I sat on my porch and listened to the night sounds of a forest that continued to grow, untroubled by those who had once threatened its existence. There was peace in that simple reality, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victory is not in conquering, but in enduring.